things that people don't realize is that during an eclipse, you can do an awful lot of different types of science. And so I'm just going to do a quick outline of the sort of science we can do and that has been done over the years during solar eclipses. So let's start by actually solar science. The sun is like a really big bar magnet. You can think of it as being, it has a north pole, it has a south pole, and it's got field lines. So if you've ever played with that thing where you put down a magnet and then you throw iron filings at it and it makes a mess, but it shows you where the magnetic field goes. Well, that's basically what we're seeing during a solar eclipse. So you can see here we've got these, the south pole, the north pole, and the lines of the magnetic field. And here what we've got is the atmosphere of the sun. And the atmosphere of the sun is extremely hot. The gas in it is ionized. That means that some of the electrons on the atoms have been knocked off. And that means that all of the particles are charged. And so they are going to react to that magnetic field. So what we're seeing here is basically something that's tracing the magnetic field in the same way that iron filings would on the bar magnet. And so we can use this to understand the corona. And the corona is something that we really don't understand well. And so we can do all sorts of different things. Here you can actually see images taken from eclipses over a number of different years where the colors are actually related to temperature. The way you can think about this is, depending on how hot the gas is, you're going to have more or less electrons attached to the atoms, and so you're going to get different colors that you're going to see. And so by taking images in just red or just green, you're able to distinguish between the cooler and hotter parts of the atmosphere, of the corona, and that means that you can actually start to understand what's going on. Here you can see an image of the sun overlaid on it. So this is what the sun looked like that day in terms of the cells on the surface of the sun. And here you can see the moon overlaid. So in this case, we actually don't see the bit right close into the atmosphere, the surface. Now, one of the things here is we cannot do this if it's not an eclipse. We can fake an eclipse by putting something up that blocks out the sun, but if it's close in, if it's not too far away from your telescope, from what's observing, what you get is light kind of leaks around the edges, and so you don't get a nice eclipse. So you have to block out more. And so typically what happens is that you're going to end up not seeing the stuff that's closest in to the sun, so you lose a lot of information. So a solar eclipse really provides us with an opportunity to learn about the solar atmosphere. It's like, well, why is that important? Well, actually the sun occasionally throws things at us. That gas that's there, it's very hot and it's full of particles that are damaging to us, and occasionally it'll just throw a blob of it at us, and we don't really understand that. So studying it is important for us to be able to predict and then think about how to protect ourselves as we get these flows of charged particles towards the Earth. Another thing that we can do during an eclipse is to test Einstein's theory of relativity. So I want to talk a little bit about Einstein's theory of relativity so that you can understand how this works. So basically, the way that Einstein envisages space is that instead of space being just a flat thing, it has a shape. It is curved. And the best way to imagine this is, imagine that you have a trampoline. You have a big elastic sheet that is, rubber sheet that is just laid out and completely flat. And so here I've got that sheet. It looks like a pool table. I've got that sheet of rubber, and I've put a rock in the middle, and it's making it bend. Now, I want you to imagine now that I roll a ball across that sheet. Now, without the rock on, it's completely flat. So if I roll a ball, I just set it going, it's just going to go in a straight line. But now it's got the rock there. If I send a ball going in this direction, it may not fall into the hole depending on how fast it's going, but it will bend because the surface has changed, and so it will move over here. Okay? So the effect of changing the shape of space is that it changes the directions that things move in. So actually for things in orbit, they are in orbit down here. They're staying in a ring around here. They can't get out. So now I want you to imagine that we're going to do that where you put different weights of things in. So if we start with the basketball, you put a basketball on there, you do a little bit of a dip. Now we're going to put a baseball in, and it's going to dip a little deeper. Now we're going to take a glass ball, a marble, and it's going to dip a little deeper. Now we're going to take a lead ball bearing, and it's going to dip deeply and sharply. And so depending on how fast the ball is moving and how close into this dip it goes, it might fall in and collide, or it might just change direction. And so that's what's happening for any mass that you have in space. So the sun is there and it changes the shape of space around it. And so as light is moving along, imagine the sun is here and there's some light coming from this hole over here. The light is coming along and it's going to bend. And so instead of receiving the light over here, we receive the light over here. Okay, so to kind of put that all together, here I've got the sun and the earth, and I've got a star over here which we shouldn't be able to see because it's behind the sun. And normally we can't see any of the stars that are behind the sun because it's daylight, right? But during an eclipse we've blocked out the sun, so now we can see them. But because the light from the star that's there is bent, we now see it and it's in the wrong position. So normally when we're looking at the star we'll only see it 6 months later, so when the Earth is on the other side of the sun, and we will see it in the night sky, but it will appear in this position. Now it looks like it's shifted. And so we can study what the stars do that are in the direction of the sun during an eclipse and see how much they move, and that allows us to test ideas within general relativity. Again, it might seem like that's not super important to people, it's kind of esoteric, but actually the way that GPS works, it relies on understanding how light moves between the so that all of the satellites are communicating with each other. You need to know exactly where they are and how fast and what the light's motion is. And the Earth is going to affect the shape of space just a little bit. And so understanding general relativity is important to things that we use every day for navigation. Okay, so another thing that we can look at is what happens to the atmosphere during an eclipse. So here what I've got is, this is showing you how much the sun, the ground is lit up if the sun is out and you have no clouds. So over here on the eastern seaboard, it's completely lit up. This is 100% of the sunlight. And over here, we're already in a partial eclipse. The sun is coming in. This is actually from the 2017 eclipse. And let's see what happens. So the sun is somewhere, the eclipse, the shadow of the moon is somewhere out in the Pacific. It's going to hit the Oregon coast in a second. And so now we have no sunlight here, and as you move away you have more and more. And so what you're getting is that there is no sunlight getting through under the spot, and you can see how much difference this makes all over the country. So everywhere sees a decrease in sunlight, and the place under the spot gets a big decrease. And so what we can do is to study what that does to the atmosphere. We can just look simply at the temperature, but we can also float balloons and find out how the temperature changes higher up in the atmosphere. We can do studies of what happens to wind speeds and all sorts of things. So there's all sorts of atmospheric effects that we can test that we cannot fake. You cannot make an atmosphere that is, you cannot simulate one that is perfect in a lab, and so you cannot make this experiment except during an eclipse. Likewise, we can look at other effects on the atmosphere. So there's a part of the atmosphere called the ionosphere. It's high up in the atmosphere, and it's where the sun's rays are still strong enough that it's ionizing the atoms. So the atoms are losing some electrons, so they're charged. And what's interesting about that is that some radio waves will bounce off. They are reflected. It makes a reflective layer. If you've ever listened to AM radio, at night you can pick up radio signals from further away, and that has to do with what happens with the sun. So here what you can see is we've got the sun, and the sun's rays are coming down into the atmosphere, and you've got these different layers that are getting ionized, and the one closest to the ground, the D layer, that one is only there during the day. At night, those atoms that have been affected by the sun's light, they start to recombine with the electrons, so it's not ionized, so it becomes transparent to the radio waves. And that means that at night you can have something that is a signal sent from the Earth, and instead of bouncing off the D layer and coming down like this, it bounces off the E layer, and so it gets further. So we can actually use the eclipse to test how the atmosphere behaves and look at how fast does the D layer recombine, how fast does it become transparent. And so again, we can look at that by looking at things from the ground, from space, by putting balloons up. So there's all sorts of experiments we can do there. There's also some really interesting experiments that we can do with plants and animals. We know that birds tend to behave oddly right before an eclipse. As it's getting darker and it's in that sort of twilight mode, the birds start to swarm. If you've ever seen starlings in a city and they do the swarming thing, they do that. But once it gets dark, they all land and it's bedtime. We know that some insects behave differently. There was a study during the 2017 eclipse that showed that bees do not buzz. So this is the cover of the journal where this was published. And this study was actually done with elementary school kids across the eclipse path. And showed that bees stop buzzing when it gets dark. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Here, this is in Wyoming, also saw the 2017 eclipse, where they're looking at the effect of the decreased sunlight on these plants and their water retention. There's also studies been done on things like mimosas, whether they close up or turn, on other animals as well. So there's all sorts of different experiments we can do to understand how life behaves when the sun behaves differently.